Good evening viewers, welcome back to my channel Literati. I am Dr. Seema Sinha. Please like and subscribe to my channel if you like the uploads which are posted here regularly with original insights on various topics of literature. Today I am going to discuss T.S.Eliot's signature poem, The Love Song of J.Alfred Prufrock. Of course, with some mention of the background of this poem as well as the theme of the poem and how it marks the moment or the arrival or the beginning of what is known as the modern age or modern poetry. This particular poem written by T.S.Eliot was begun by him in 1910. Finally, he worked on it and finally he published it as a part of a collection known as Prufrock and Other Observations, which came out in 1917. Taking a look at the background or the historical events of this time period, which is very, very significant in order to understand any great work of art, because every bit of creative expression, whether it is in the form of literature or painting or any artistic expression, is a reflection of the times in which it was created. The ambience, the atmosphere, the general trends of that particular age, that particular period are reflected in a very significant manner in that artistic work. This poem began in 1910, finally published as a part of a collection in 1917, covers a very, very important period. It was the beginning of the 20th century, obviously, the end of the 19th century. Queen Victoria had died in 1901 after a long and a glorious period of rule, covering almost the entire 19th century, known as the Victorian Age, which made very far-reaching, or it had a far-reaching impact on all the aspects of life globally, because we must remember that it was also the age of imperialism and England was the empire where the sun never set. Officially, the age of Queen Victoria ended in 1901 with her death. What followed was a period of about a decade, which is known as the Edwardian era. The Victorian age had made its mark and its impact on all the aspects of literary expression. This first decade of the 20th century has a slightly different outlook, though not radically different, but still the age of technology had definitely arrived. There were landmark moments in the first 5 years of the 20th century itself. The establishment of the Ford Motor Company, the beginning of the automobile industry, revolutionized the way of travel, like the railways had done in the 19th century. Now it was the personal way of travel which was made easier and very convenient. It also led to faster transport, a rise in export and import, and of course the historic beginning of airline travel, which showed its significant possibilities in the first flight of the Wright brothers, again in 1903. The theory of relativity by Einstein marked a breakthrough in scientific theories. On the whole, the Industrial Revolution, which had taken place previously, had created a far-reaching impact, and the possibilities were enormous, which are being explored in unimaginable ways. It, of course, had a very deep impact. There were mixed feelings. There was, of course, enthusiasm as well as a feeling of skepticism. We can say the inroads of technology in almost all the aspects of life was unprecedented. It led to complete lifestyle changes. Electricity came, telephone, communication, telegraph. Everything seemed to mark the beginning of the 20th century as a period where it was on the threshold of great possibilities. But then, as I said, the feelings were mixed. There was the elder generation who looked with almost feeling of skepticism, and then the new generation which embraced it with open arms. So we can say the first decade was very, very significant. It lasted from 1910, and this period is known as the Edwardian era. Poets like Hausmann, Rupert Brooke were writing. The modern drama had made its mark in the last decades of the previous century, with dramatists or Norwegian dramatists like Ibsen, whose significant work. And so the first 10 years, this was before World War I had begun. It was not even a possibility in the minds of people. But then when we consider when Prufrock was written by T.S.Eliot, when he began writing it in 1910, he completed it during the years of World War I. Dramatists like Ibsen and Chekhov had created their landmark place in the last century, the 19th century, and also in the first decade of the 20th century. And English dramatists like Shaw had embraced this new drama, which is known as the drama of ideas, and they were exploring it to its full potential. Coming back to this poem, The Love Song of J.Alfred Prufrock, it establishes a complete break from the traditional forms of poetry writing. This is the beginning of the modern age in English poetry. What are the marks? We have already discussed modern poetry, modern literature, and postmodern literature. This is the beginning of the modern literature, the first half of the 20th century. And if we want to pinpoint or give it an exact date or exact time, or the work which marks this change in the realm of poetry, we can consider The Love Song of J.Alfred Prufrock as the signature poem marking the beginning of modern age in English poetry. All the aspects which are characteristics of modern poetry are expressed for the first time in The Love Song of J.Alfred Prufrock. What are these? Which mark a revolutionary and a complete break from the poetic expression of the Victorian age and even the Edwardian age. If we look at the poem, The Love Song of J.Alfred Prufrock, the opening lines again give us a jolt, give us a shock. But before that, let us consider the aspects or the characteristics or the definite qualities of modern poetry which are visible in The Love Song of J.Alfred Prufrock for the first time, jolting the senses of the reading public and marking the new beginnings or a change of direction in English poetry. There are many. The first is the use of an everyday speech. It is spoken in a very prosaic language. there is the marked intellectual element. T.S.Eliot has brought in the intellectual seriousness of a very intense kind in English poetry. It is realistic, it is certainly not romantic, and it is a note of high seriousness. Realism is, of course, the most outstanding characteristic of modern literature. As far as emotions are concerned, the main emotion of modern literature, modern poetry, is one of pessimism. There is a sense of deep rift, conflict, hopelessness in modern poetry, which is expressed in a very profound way in the love song of J.Alfred Prufrock, apart from other works of T.S.Eliot, again mentioning The Wasteland, that great epic, which is a statement on the disintegration of the modern day civilization. And as is very obvious, the impact of World War I and then again World War II has been singularly the greatest impact on English literature. The images, the symbolists, which were the poets of the first or the early 20th century, influenced T.S.Eliot, and the influence is visible in almost all his poems, in the love song of J.Alfred Prufrock, as well as, of course, The Wasteland. World War I, the years of World War I, from 1914 to 1918, also bred a new group of poets, which were known as the war poets. The chief names among them were Rupert Brooke, Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen. These young men who were also casualties of World War I, because an entire generation of young men was wiped out. They exhibit that same sense of reality and pessimism because they deal with the theme of war in their poems. That is why they're known as the war poets, in a very realistic manner. They don't display it as something grand, something heroic, something noble, but they show the futility of war and how it creates a tragedy of epic proportions, how it is a senseless exercise, how it is a waste of life. So this pessimism is shared by these war poets, which also, though small and though they wrote for a brief time because almost all of them died in the World War I, also mark, or they are a very significant group which exhibit this new sensibility in English poetry. If we want to give a timeline to the development of English poetry after the Edwardian age, which lasts from 1901 to about 1910, then we can consider modern poetry to begin from 1909. It begins from 1909, marking the close of the Edwardian era, and it can be said to last from 1909 up to the war years, that is 1916. This new, or this modern literature, or modern poetry, reached its full potential between 1917 to 1929. One of the great names during this period is that of W.H. Auden. 1929, we remember, was another very disturbing year and the beginning of the Great Economic Depression, which made the world a very depressing and a very dismal place. It created a havoc which was a complete contrast from the mood of the 1920s, which had succeeded World War I, a kind of reckless gaiety, a kind of disbelief, a kind of escapism from the horror of World War I. But the year 1929, the economic crash, the Great Depression, which made its impact felt all over Europe, particularly in New York and in London, with the crashing of the stock markets, made the world a very disturbing place. And as the depression intensified itself in the 1930s, it culminated into the horror of Second World War, which began in 1939 and which lasted till 1945. So this, in brief, is the timeline or the time frame. And then, of course, we cannot exactly compartmentalize it. But then after the World War II, after the aftermaths of the World War, both the world wars, the 1930s and beyond, in the 1940s, this modern literature continues to grow, exhibit the characteristics, the chief characteristics, that is of subjectivity, pessimism, disturbance, realism, which is sordid and ugly, and the trauma which is experienced by the world due to the world wars. Not to say that there was no element of romanticism. It was exhibited in some poets like Yeats, W.B. Yeats and Walter de la Mare, who turned to nature and who explored the beauty of nature. But overall, the modern poetry, which begins from the second decade, feature of modern literature of the 20th century. So subjectivity, pessimism, everyday speech, realism, these are, in a nutshell, the main characteristics. Let us go back to the love song of J.Alfred Prufrock. Another element which T.S.Eliot has established and which is a great part of his poetic expression is intertextuality. That is, he takes references, sources, quotations from many works of literature in different languages, in different texts. This is in keeping with his critical theory, which he has propounded in his path-breaking essay, Tradition and Individual Talent, where he accentuates on the fact or asserts that literature is an ongoing tradition and it is continuous, it is ever-flowing. Each writer, each poet, each artist, literary artist, owes something to what has gone on before and is rooted in his own time, as well as he will have an impact on the future. Literature belongs to a tradition and the individual talent has a place in that ongoing tradition. In keeping with this view, the love song of J.Alfred Prufrock also begins with an epigraph. This is from Dante's Divine Comedy and the quotation is from Inferno, where two damned souls are talking to each other and there is a note of perplexity. One asks a question and the other damned soul, they are tormented souls in purgatory, that is in hell, and the answer is one of uncertainty, of doubt, of despair, because they are not certain of any truth. That is their torment. That is the spiritual torment which they are exhibiting. By placing this epigraph right in the beginning or the opening of his pioneering work, The Love Song of J.Alfred Prufrock, T.S.Eliot has managed to create that mood of hopelessness, of doubt, of despair, of a feeling of a deep spiritual despair. Now, as far as the title, The Love Song of J.Alfred Prufrock, many comments have been made on this title of the unromantic sounding name, J.Alfred Prufrock, and the fact that it is supposed to be a love song, which goes completely against the idea of romance. The very name itself seems odd, prosaic, unromantic. It seems awkward. But this is the love song of the modern day protagonist. We must consider J.Alfred Prufrock as the modern day protagonist, who represents the modern day man and the modern day reality. The modern day man is not heroic. The modern day man is a puny creature. The modern day man is full of a sense of self-doubt, like the tormented souls in hell, the purgatory of Dante's Divine Comedy. This torment is never ending. And so our protagonist, J.Alfred Prufrock, representing mankind at large, is not a heroic character. He is not a noble soul. He is a pitiful person. He is a representation of the sickness of the modern world. Remember that this poem was begun and composed finally and published during the years of World War I. So that element of hopelessness is present, or it has already made its mark in the psyche of the modern man. The images which T.S.Eliot has created have a starkness and which created a shock value, because the images are not of poetic beauty as one would find perhaps in a romantic poem, in a love poem, but the images are one of sickness, ugliness, despair, disturbance, conflict, and self-doubt. The poet says, the very beginning lines say, "Let us go then, you and I." Who are you and I? There is just one person, then who is you and I? This you and I points out to the fragmentary personality of the modern day man. The modern day man has no stability in his life. The modern day man is a man who is split into two. He has a split personality. There is no coherence in his life. He does not have the stability of values, of belief, of faith. He is a personality who is disintegrated, who is fragmentary. And another very remarkable quality of modern day poetry is that it's in its expression, it is disjointed and fragmentary. The harmony of composition is not present in modern poetry. And in this poetry, the lack of harmony points out to the lack of harmony in the protagonist's life. Our modern day hero is an unheroic character. The protagonist is pitiful. The protagonist is isolated. The protagonist is lonely. The protagonist is full of self-doubt. The protagonist does not have any self-confidence. The entire poem is in 140 lines, so I will discuss it in two parts. So let us take this as the first part and take a look at the first stanza. The first line, "Let us go then, you and I." There's just one person. Another characteristic, or which is quality of modern day poetry, is that it is not only subjective, but it is also in the form of a dramatic monologue, a soliloquy, following a stream of consciousness technique, moving from one kind of thought to another. You and I are the two aspects of the split personality of the protagonist, J.Alfred Prufrock. And the split personality is one of his private self, which is full of torment, uncertainty, loneliness, and the other is the public persona, which our protagonist, or any contemporary man, any modern man, he is a representation of the modern day man, shows to the world, because he is not honest with himself or honest with the world. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. One of the most famous images in English poetry. The evening or the world itself is sick, morally sick. The image of physical sickness corresponds with this image of moral sickness. And the world which is described in the first stanza is a world which is ravaged and torn by war, because they are images of war which intrude. The lonely streets, the air raid sirens, the isolation, the streets meandering and with no visible signs of life, the sawdust which is spread on the floors to absorb the impact of the bombs. Because you must remember that this was the 20th century, the worst war of the 20th century, fought in trenches, but also with modern day weapons like machine guns and the building of bombings from bomber planes. They were very rudimentary, but they were bombs which had dropped from the sky. Another very devastating aspect of war. And the sawdust was spread on the floors to absorb the impact, which would shatter the window panes and, of course, cause the walls to fall down. And so the first image of a patient etherized on a table compared to the evening sky is a shocking image of moral sickness and physical sickness. The air of threat, of some kind of ominous warning, disturbance in the atmosphere is presented in the next images of the lonely streets, which are called muttering retreats, the bomb shelters, the sawdust spread on the floors, and the images of some kind of underlying threat, the insidious intent, and then to the personal trauma of our unheroic hero, the pitiful J.Alfred Prufrock. The first stanza ends with the lines, "Oh, do not ask, what is it? Let us go and make our visit." And before that, he is struggling with himself. He says, to lead you to an overwhelming question. What is that overwhelming question which J.Alfred Prufrock cannot muster enough courage to ask? That is his love song. That is the proposal which he wants to make. But he does not have the confidence. And if he asks the question and he is rejected, he fears that rejection. That fear is overwhelming, that sense of rejection, that he is already a fragmentary personality, and he feels that if the rejection comes, he will be someone who disintegrates completely. He will not be able to accept it, and it will erode his very existence. He cannot muster up enough courage to ask a question which he is somehow willing himself to ask. And that is his question, his proposal, that is his love song. But instead of a man on the top of the world, full of swagger and confidence and romance and hope and love, our modern day protagonist, J.Alfred Prufrock, his love song is not something which fills him with high spirits, but it leads him to greater torment and a sense of doubt. The first stanza ends, and then come two lines which occur and recur in the entire poem as a kind of a constant refrain. This repetition or this echo of lines, T.S.Eliot takes up in his later poems also, particularly in The Wasteland, where he creates a feeling of continuity, because it is like a collection of images and impressions and chaotic pictures from different sources. But these are the underlying currents or undercurrents or the threads which kind of create a continuity and make his poem a whole. These two lines, in the room the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. Michelangelo, that famous Renaissance artist, is mentioned to create an atmosphere, a refinement of sophistication, of culture, of taste, of an upper class life, from which J.Alfred Prufrock feels excluded. He does not have the confidence. And the women who are sophisticated, who are sure of themselves, they seem to him remote, out of his reach, out of his world. He watches them and it seems to them that they live in a world which is alien to him. He is not a part of that culture, that refinement, that beauty, that perfection. He is struggling in his own private hell, like the tormented souls in Dante's Purgatory. The next stanza brings us a beautiful poetic image of one of the favorite muses of T.S.Eliot, and that is the image of a cat. He beautifully synchronizes this image of the leaping cat, graceful, powerful, beautiful, and with a fluidity of movement, and he synchronizes it with the curling of the smoke in the modern day world, because the world of the 20th century is an industrialized world. There is the element of the industrial reality visible in the slums, in the factory housings, in the factory chimneys which spew out smoke, and of course the filth and the pollution. But comparing it, the curling smoke, to the leaping movements of the cat, T.S. Eliot creates a moment, a brief moment of beauty and forgetfulness for the protagonist also. The lines are: the yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes, the yellow smoke that rubs its muzzle on the window panes, licked its tongue into the corners of the evening, lingered upon the pools that stand in drains. So the image of the drains, the image of the smoke, contrasting with the swirling, graceful, almost dancing movement of the smoke, compared to a cat. Lets fall upon its back the soot that falls from chimneys, slipped by the terrace, made a sudden leap, and seeing that it was a soft October night, curled once above the house and fell asleep. Beautiful lines and a spell of poetic description with contrasting images of drains, of soot, of chimneys, portrayed through the lovely, graceful, dancing, almost mesmerizing movement of the cat, which moves so softly, so gracefully, with such fluidity, and the drains, the soot are the reminder of the reality, and that is a momentary spell of forgetfulness or imagination for a protagonist who is charmed into a brief moment or lull of forgetfulness by looking at the swirling smoke, comparing it to the movements of a cat. But then, in the next lines, reality comes back to him once again to crush him beneath its weight. And he says, and indeed there will be time for the yellow smoke that slides along the street, rubbing its back upon the window panes. There will be time to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet.